Event tonight dealing with this big topic, is Christianity credible? My name's Sophie Corns and I'll be hosting us tonight. Welcome to, if you're joining us from the live stream, people connecting in from afar. Tonight we're thinking about this topic, is Christianity credible? Many people might come with questions to the Christian faith and find that they have in their mind skeptical barriers that might stop them from taking their investigations further. Perhaps you might find that there's skepticism about the credibility of the Christian faith from a scientific point of view. Perhaps trying to add up what the Christian faith claims compared with understandings of modern science. Or it could be that from a historical perspective, there's queries about how the Bible matches up with secular literature. We're going to think tonight about the credibility of the Christian faith from different perspectives. We have with us experts in different fields helping us to piece together what is the credibility of the Christian faith. We'll be asking the question, is Christianity credible scientifically, historically, and personally? Tonight is going to be in the format of TED-style talks. They're short, snappy, buzzy talks to get us thinking. They won't say everything, but they'll get us thinking. And it's not just to be a time tonight for us to listen to lectures, but rather to open up a discussion. And so at the end, there'll be an opportunity for a question and answer time. On the screen, along the way, there'll be a number which you can text in questions if you want to have those addressed at the end. And our different experts will be helping us to think through the answers to them. For now, I'd like to introduce our first expert. We're first going to be tackling the question, is Christianity credible scientifically? Our speaker is going to be Dr. Sharon Dirks. She's got a PhD from Cambridge University in brain imaging and has held research positions in Oxford University and the Medical College of Wisconsin, US. She's also an author and a speaker with particular expertise in the connections between the philosophy and the world of neuroscience. So please put your hands together as we welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, scientific endeavour is held in high esteem today, is it not? The work of scientists and doctors and engineers has sent people into space. It has developed the internet. It has sequenced every gene in the human body. And we all know now how scientific endeavour is helping us climb our way out of this global pandemic that we find ourselves in. In terms of scientific achievement, there is a lot to be thankful for. And yet, when religious beliefs enter the conversation, things seem to get more complex. So I'd like to take a few minutes to consider this question: is Christianity believable scientifically? There are a few different angles that we could look at. Firstly, some people seem to have the view that belief in God is in conflict with scientific inquiry. Science deals in facts and certainties. Religion deals with superstition and anti-intellectual approaches to life. Science and God are incompatible, and therefore you must choose between them. This was actually my own story. I knew I loved science from an early age. I arrived at university to study biochemistry in the 1990s, and I arrived there an agnostic, not even completely sure how I had arrived at this view, but I was of the view that science and God were incompatible, until I was invited to an event called Guerrilla Christian, where there were a number of Christians and you could ask any question. And so I asked mine: surely you can't believe in God and be a scientist at the same time. And I discovered that to say that science and God are in conflict is a bit like saying that the programming languages underlying Facebook are in conflict with the existence of Mark Zuckerberg. Now you look at those things and say, of course those two things are not in conflict. They are different levels of explanation. One is describing the underlying mechanisms, and the other is the one whose idea it was, who set it up and continues to uphold it today. It's the same with God and science. There's no logical conflict between studying the mechanisms in the natural world and believing in a God who set it all going in the first place. This was really a new piece of information for me, and that marked the beginning of a journey of asking more questions and grilling more Christians. Secondly, this question perhaps is getting at, is Christianity considered believable by scientists? Well, there are scientists who believe in God, and there are scientists who do not. Historically, there have been a number of significant scientists whose belief in God inspired and drove forward their science. If God exists, then their belief was that the natural world is not accidental. It is purposefully made by God, and therefore we can expect to find laws and trends and things that are repeatable and testable. And as C.S. Lewis put it, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver, in other words, God. One such scientist would be the 19th century Scotsman, James Clerk Maxwell, who was the first Cavendish Professor of Physics at the University of Cambridge, best known for his work on electromagnetic theory. Cavendish is also known for having some words from Psalm 111 inscribed above the door of the Cavendish labs. Those words say this: "Great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them." For Clerk Maxwell, who was also a Christian, science was a way of discovering and pondering the world that God had made. Today, we could point to people like Professor Alistair McGrath, Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. We could point to Francis Collins, who is the director of NIH and directing the vaccine rollout in the USA as we speak. And Joan Centrella, a professor of astronomy at NASA, amongst many others. McGrath and Collins actually arrived at college as students as agnostics or even atheists, but underwent a profound change of belief during their time studying the sciences. And Joan Centrella returned to her childhood faith after 15 years of walking away from it. And Centrella says this: "I chose to follow Christ because his words in the Gospels impressed me as being true in a very deep and fundamental way." And so there are many scientists who do not believe in God. We know this. But there are also many successful scientists who hold strong Christian beliefs and who even change their mind about God while studying the sciences. Now, the phrasing of the question that we're looking at tonight, is Christianity believable scientifically, kind of assumes that science is the lens through which this question must be pressed in order to assess its validity. Science is the lens through which everything is assessed. But we also need to ask the question, how is it that science is even possible in the first place? How is it that we can think logically and rationally about anything, scientific or otherwise? Why do we have a mind at all? Is science itself enough to explain the human mind? Because on one level, you've got neurons and electrical activity and brain chemistry and hormones and all the physical stuff going on inside your skull. But then you also have thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. Yes, you have a brain, but there is also something that it is like to be you, that your brain chemistry doesn't capture in the same way. If I want to ask you how your day went, putting you in an MRI scanner, taking some brilliant structural and functional scans, putting an EEG cap on you as well, isn't going to tell me that information. It might tell me some very interesting things, but it won't tell me how your day was. For that, I need to ask you. You see, there are some aspects of life and of what it means to be a human being where we reach the limit of what science can tell us. And arguably, there is something unique about this inner reality. There's an inner you. There's a mind. Some might say, a soul. Now, some say the mind is just chemical reactions. But if that's true, then how is it that we are able to transcend those reactions to draw conclusions about the rest of the physical world? If our minds are made of the same stuff as the world we're studying, how on earth is it going to help us say anything useful about the natural world? But in order to operate as a scientist, you transcend the processes in your brain to make conclusions and inferences about the world. Where does that come from? How do you explain that? And of course, if all you have to work with is physics and chemistry, the human mind is incredibly hard to explain. And some might say impossible. And this has been debated for centuries, not a new question at all. Many agnostics and atheists today agree that scientific descriptions are not enough to explain the mind. They only get you so far. And then we need to look to other possibilities. And maybe it comes down to this kind of question. Is what we see with our eyes all that there is in this world? Is the material world all that there is? And if we entertain the possibility that God exists, does that help us to make sense of the human mind? Well, a number of key philosophers and scientists would say yes. If God exists, then mind is fundamental to the universe and has given rise to everything else. The very first words of the Bible say, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." In other words, we didn't start with chemicals and molecules. We started with God. Or we could look at the first words of John's Gospel, which say, "In the beginning was the Word." And the Greek word for word is logos. And that is the word from which we get logic. You see, if God exists, then we can say we have a mind because God does. We think because he does, which means, contrary to popular belief, to believe in God is to be a thinker because he is the very source of the mind that we use in the sciences. So arguably, science is possible because God exists. Or as Professor Richard Swinburne would put it, I postulate God to explain why science explains. Now, finally and very briefly, is there any scientific evidence for Christianity? Well, I wouldn't want to go so far as proof. I don't think we can talk about scientific proof for God. But there are some very interesting observations going on in clinical medicine that certainly give us pause for thought when people try to say that physics and chemistry is all that there is to a person and all that there is to this world. One such area is that of near-death experiences, which are coming up in medicine now all the time with the advent of certain surgeries that require a patient to be in a state of clinical death. Their body is cooled, there's no heartbeat, there's no brain signal. And roughly 7 to 10% of patients across the world are reporting consciousness, despite the fact that all of the parts of their brain required for consciousness have shut down and have been clinically shut down for the purposes of the surgery. Now, of course, this is an area where some of these things could have been fabricated, but there are also some very interesting stories coming out from people that were skeptical and then had a change of mind. One such person would be the Harvard neurosurgeon Eben Alexander, who prior to his own near-death experience was very much a physicalist. If you don't have a working brain, you can't be conscious. Until he underwent a severe case of bacterial meningitis at the age of 54, was in a coma for 7 days. His entire neocortex had shut down, the parts of the brain responsible for higher functioning. He was not expected to survive. His family were told to put their affairs in order. But incredibly, he went on to survive and then went on to describe this incredibly vivid experience he had, including meeting somebody that he later discovered and corroborated as being a sister that he never knew he had. He was adopted. She had died before he was born, but he described her in very great detail and saw a photo of her and said, "This is the person I saw in my experience." These things give us pause for thought when we're faced with the notion that all you are is molecules. There's something more. Even in the neurosciences, we see that there might be something more to us. And you see, if matter is all that exists in this world, experiences like this make no sense. If the brain dies, the person dies. End of story, game over. But if God does exist, we can make sense of this, because at the heart of the Christian faith is a person, Jesus Christ, who died for us and rose from the dead. A Christian faith that says death is not the end. Jesus has said that he is the resurrection and the life, that whoever believes in him will live even though they die. Do you believe this? And what's interesting is in my journey, I came to realize that these words were true. And I came to put my trust in the person of Jesus Christ as a young adult. From that point onwards, I continued to use my mind in the pursuit of science, whilst also knowing the God behind it all. And it was the beginning of an adventure. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sharon Dirks. Feel free to make the most of this number on the screen to text in your questions. We're going to have a little pause now. Having heard about those thoughts, we're going to hear a piece of music performed. Our conviction is that the Christian faith has something to say in every realm of life, including the world of the arts. And so now we're going to hear a piece performed by Ali Mosley and Lydia Lansdowne. The song is Amazing Grace, a song which speaks profoundly about the change that the Christian faith can bring to an individual. Let's listen to them play.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 1,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
We've engaged with how Christianity speaks into the world of the sciences, and just now a little taste of the arts as well. Next, we're going to think about the question, is Christianity credible historically? Our expert on the subject is Professor Simon Gathercole. He lectures in New Testament and early Christianity at Cambridge University. He is editor of the journal New Testament Studies and is particularly interested in analysing how texts from the Bible compare with other writings from their time. So please give him a warm welcome as he comes to the stage.
Thanks very much for having me. This subject is an important one because Christianity is not basically about sort of ethical principles or not only about timeless truths, but it's also about historical events which happened, especially what Jesus Christ of Nazareth did 2,000 years ago. And it's those historical events that I'm going to be talking about here. So beginning with the most basic question of all, did a historical Jesus actually exist? Well, on this point, there's a consensus of opinion, not just among Christian biblical scholars, but also among ancient historians and classicists as well, who study from a secular point of view. There's also an agreement on this question in the ancient world as well. There were lots of people who wrote skeptically about Christianity in the ancient world after the advent of after Christianity came along, but none of them adopted the strategy of saying that Jesus didn't exist. That was something that everyone just assumed. And in fact, the non-Christian evidence, although it's mostly negative about Christianity, does mention Jesus often as a real person. So these four characters here, Josephus, Jewish historian, writing at the end of the first century, and Pliny, Tacitus, and Suetonius, writing at the beginning of the second century, all talk about Christ and Christians as historically existing. I have to confess, I actually photoshopped the Tacitus picture because I couldn't find one in the same series, but he did really exist. The first Christian evidence as well also comes very quickly. It comes from only 20 years after the death of Jesus in the writings of the Apostle Paul. Now, it's sometimes objected that there's no Roman record, no court records of Jesus' trial and execution. But actually, this is entirely what one would expect. We don't have ancient trial records of especially non-elites. And so it's very common when you're talking about ancient characters to find people for whom there's no evidence from exactly during their lifetime. Often when we're talking about ancient figures, we're talking about testimony about them that comes after their deaths. So, for example, in the case of the Chinese philosopher Confucius, he's only mentioned first in history after his death. Same with Spartacus. the Roman who led a slave revolt. So it's what one would expect, that we don't find references to Jesus from that short window during which he was a public figure. So overall, there can't be serious doubt that Jesus was a historical figure. So what about the main evidence for Jesus, the Gospels in the New Testament? Can we regard them as plausible historically? Well, first, there's the agreement with the non-Christian evidence that I've hinted at already. There's agreement with Josephus on the small amount of information that he gives us. There's one controversial reference, one debated reference in Josephus, but another that's not debated. And then when we come back to Tacitus, this also isn't a statue of Tacitus really either, I'm afraid, but the text really is from Tacitus. Tacitus reports that the person who instigated the Christians, as he calls them, was a character called Christus, which means Messiah. And Messiah, King of the Jews, the promised king in Israel's scripture, is exactly what the Gospels claim Jesus is. Then Tacitus, as you can see, says that this Christus, suffered the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, which also is what is said in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that Jesus was crucified during the time of Tiberius, who was emperor between AD 14 and AD 37. And then the Gospels also talk about the procurator or the prefect Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, which narrows it down further to between 26 AD and 36 AD. So Tiberius and Pontius Pilate are also mentioned in the Gospels, as well as in authority when Christ was active. And Tacitus also mentions the detail, also mentioned in the Gospels, that this took place in Judea, the Roman province, which we call, which is sort of the southern part of Israel today. So there's also important evidence for the plausibility of the Gospels in the way that it fits with what we know about the culture of the time. We know quite a lot about the culture of Judaism in the first century from lots of Jewish sources which have survived. So one particular way in which the Gospels fit with our external evidence is in their use of, is in what people are called in the Gospels, the names people have. Now, that might seem like an odd thing to talk about, but actually Jews were named by very specific names in one part of the Roman Empire, and they had very different names in other parts of the Roman Empire, in Judea versus Egypt, say. And what we see, if we look at the way Jews were called in Palestine, which is where Jesus and his disciples operated, the match between the kinds of names is very close. So the top two men's names and the top two women's names are the same and account for roughly the same proportion. Similarly, the top 9 women's names and top nine men's names as well. So this is something that you wouldn't necessarily get right if you didn't have the local knowledge and local source material that the gospel writers have. The gospel writers also get the calendar right, what Jews called the names of the days of the week, the festivals they celebrated, the festival, not just Passover, it's a well-known one like that, but also the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Dedication, and those kinds of details as well. They also, and this is a point that really sort of impressed me and surprised me. If you look at the place names mentioned in the Gospels, they're often very small and very obscure villages. They're villages which are often mentioned only maybe 100 or 200 years later in a Jewish source. So again, the Gospels have the kind of information about place names that you could only get from local knowledge, only get from local sources. So that's just a selection. You could also compare coins and names of officials and other details like that. And the reason the Gospels get these details right is because their authors either were eyewitnesses of Jesus themselves, or they had access to this local eyewitness source material. They were written close enough to the time of the events that they're writing about to have detailed and precise, reliable information. So the Gospels are very different from the kind of folklore that we might associate with characters like King Arthur or Robin Hood, for example. In the case of Arthur of Wessex and Robin of Sherwood, we only have tales about them from about 200 years after they were supposed to have lived. A very big time frame indeed. So, for example, in the case of Robin Hood, one authority has written, this book is about a legend rather than a man. Between the origin of the legend and the first surviving versions of about 1450, there was an interval of over 200 years. Or similar with King Arthur. The fact of the matter is, there is no historical evidence about Arthur. We must reject him from our histories and above all from the titles of our books. Now, if we compare this with where we are with Jesus, we've got a much tighter time frame. We've got only decades, not centuries, separating Jesus from the first Christian reference, from the first gospel being written, and then the first non-Christian reference in Josephus. So we're in a very good position to assess the historical evidence there. When you come, though, to later fictional gospels, other gospels, as I've put up here, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the so-called apocryphal gospels that you find mentioned in places like the Da Vinci Code, there we have a very different story. Those gospels are later legends, those outside the New Testament, those outside the Bible, and they make the kind of classic historical howlers that you'd expect if someone was writing a story about something centuries later. They, for example, get the geography wrong, saying things like that Nazareth is a place in Bethlehem, where actually they're two separate towns 100 miles apart. So they make those classic mistakes that you'd expect to make if you don't have the right source material. So, what are the key things that the Gospels say about Jesus then? Well, first, one absolutely cast iron fact that everyone agrees on was that Jesus was a teacher. Jesus taught about the advent of God's reign, and he talked about himself. He talked about himself as the Son of God who could forgive sins, and he talked about himself as the sacrifice for human offences against God. And in the course of this, he attracted a lot of attention, both positive from disciples, but also negative from hostile authorities. And he was accused of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God, and he was accused by the Romans of sedition because he claimed to be a king. Now, secondly, Jesus was also widely known as a miracle worker. This again might strike you as a strange thing to mention in a talk about historical reliability and historical plausibility of the Gospels. But actually, Jesus was widely known as a miracle worker, not just by the Jews who believed in him, the disciples, but also by the Jews who didn't believe in him. They were all Jews, the people that he dealt with. The disciples, the Jewish disciples, thought that Jesus' miraculous power came from God. Those who didn't thought that he was a magician, a sort of sorcerer, who derived his power from the devil. But there was actually agreement in that conflict over the fact that Jesus did in fact perform miracles. Thirdly, we've already mentioned from Tacitus the execution of Jesus' crucifixion, which again is a pretty certain historical fact. If you remember what Tacitus says, he reports, like the Gospels do, that the execution of Jesus took place when Pontius Pilate was prefect of Judea, and when the Emperor Tiberius was princeps, was the emperor. Finally, the most stupendous thing that the Gospels report is Jesus' resurrection, that after Jesus died, God raised him from the dead. Now, this is obviously a different kind of historical event, one that I can't sort of prove historically, but it nevertheless does account for a lot of unusual facts. It accounts for the fact that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty by his disciples. It accounts for the fact that many hundreds of disciples saw Jesus or appearances of Jesus not long after his death. It also explains why, for example, his brothers believed in him as Son of God. I don't know if you've got a brother or sister, but I don't know how good a time you find, how easy you'd find it to persuade them that you were the Son of God. Jesus' brothers were some of the earliest missionaries. And it also explains how millions of people today, like me, find joy in knowing Jesus. Because that's what this barrage of historical information is really about in the end. It's not about an ancient, curious, interesting character like Tacitus or Spartacus. It's about real life, as our theme is this week. And what the Gospels say make excellent sense of what Jesus is. They're excellent historical evidence for who he was, the fact that he lived and died. But Jesus didn't just live and die. He also died and lived. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have one more person to speak to us tonight, but first, I'd like to tell you about some other events coming up over this week. This event tonight comes as the first of a series of events happening across this week called the Real Life Week. It's an opportunity to see how the Christian faith connects with real life, and we've got a short video that gives us a flavour of what's coming up this week that we're going to watch now.
When a friend asks, "How are you?" what do you say? "I'm not too bad, I'm feeling a bit tired but doing okay. I'm fine. I'm fine." It's simple, it's polite, it's easy, it's uncomplicated, but often it's not real. It's not the truth, is it? The truth is that real life is complicated. The truth is that real life is full of troubles, big and small. It's longing for just 5 minutes of time to yourself. It's dreading another night in on your own. It's realising that mums and dads don't know all the answers. It's realising that your parents won't be around for much longer. It's watching the hours drag by in a job you can't stand. It's falling asleep on the bus after a hectic night shift. It's wishing you'd made the most of things when you had the chance, wishing that you could go back and erase the past. It's wishing that the year 2020 never happened. It's doing everything you're supposed to and still ending up at the bottom of the pile. It's getting everything you wanted and wondering whether any of it matters anyway. That's just life, isn't it? My life and yours. But here's the thing. There are literally billions of people around the world and down the centuries who are convinced that Jesus can offer us something more. Maybe you're not particularly religious yourself. Maybe you have spiritual beliefs, but you still have massive questions. Maybe after the year we've all had, like many of us, you're wondering whether we can find meaning and security and hope. Well, whoever you are, whatever you believe, maybe you'd like to hear a bit more about what Jesus said and what Christians believe. This summer we're putting on a number of events to help you to do just that. So why don't you come and listen as we explore together real life and the real difference that Jesus can make. Jesus said, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full."
As we previewed there, the Real Life Events Week comes with many different events to enjoy. Tomorrow night, there will be a chance to enjoy a microbrewery, having a tour of the brewery, and also the chance to quiz a pastor with your best questions on the Christian faith. Tuesday night is a wine tasting evening, just for ladies to come and enjoy and hear a personal perspective of what it's like to follow Jesus. Then, as was mentioned in that video, on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, there's the opportunity to hear from different unique and intriguing stories of people whose lives have personally been transformed by Christianity. In one case, that is the story of an ex-convict having committed murder. In another case, of someone who's suffered with mental illness and abuse, speaking about Christian hope. In another case, it's someone battling from terminal cancer, trying to look for real hope. The week will culminate on Sunday, where we would like to invite you to join us at church, where there'll be an adult baptism service, 9 adults who have decided for themselves to follow Jesus, and will tell the story of why they've made that decision. But let me first, at this point, now introduce our third speaker. We've thought about the question, is Christianity credible scientifically and historically? And now we're going to think, is Christianity credible personally? For that, our speaker is Neil Powell. He has previously worked as senior pastor of City Church Birmingham for over 20 years. And during that time, he has enjoyed speaking to people of all faiths and of none. And now he's going to speak to us on this topic, is Christianity credible personally? Put your hands together as we welcome him.
Good evening, everybody. Well, here's how the story goes. Albert Einstein has just set an exam to a group of second-year physics students. He was teaching them at Princeton University. His teaching assistant approached him and asked, "Dr. Einstein, wasn't that the same exam you gave to the same class of students last year?" Einstein replied, "Yes, it was the same exam." His assistant asked, "Why would you give the same exam to the same class 2 years in a row?" Einstein replied, "Because the answers have changed." Now, the reason I start with that story is because I think it tells us something of what has happened in our own culture over the past 100 years or so. As human beings, we keep asking exactly the same questions. Questions of purpose. Is there meaning to life? Questions of fulfillment. How can I be happy? Questions of hope. Is this life all that there is? Questions of identity. What does it mean to be human? Our questions haven't changed, but our answers have. You see, anyone born at the start of the 20th century, and indeed all of the centuries before that, the answers would have almost certainly been religious ones. But for those born at the start of the 21st century, the answers are often anything but religious. See, ours is a secular society. Just under 40%, it's estimated, of the UK population say they are of no religion. And for many, it's simply been a case of, well, not quite seeing what the point is of a religious faith. Apparently, Napoleon asked the great mathematical physician Pierre-Simon Laplace, "Is it true that there's no mention of the solar system's creator, i.e. God, in your writings?" Laplace famously answered, "I had no need of that hypothesis." For him, science gave all of the answers. And Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor expresses what has happened in the Western world when he says it was virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, 1500 in our Western society, while in 2000, many of us would find it not only easy, but inescapable not to believe in God. So I want to ask this question of you this evening. Does anybody need religion? I don't know where you stand on that. There is a theory, it's called the secularization hypothesis, that the more sophisticated a society becomes, the further back God goes into the background until he disappears altogether. Modern people find answers to life and purpose and meaning from this world and this life. And a generation ago, I think the secularization hypothesis was prevalent. But what we're observing now is something of a change. John Micklethwaite was editor of The Economist, and he wrote a few years ago a book entitled "God is Back: how the global revival of faith is changing the world. And he highlights, along with many others, that still in the 21st century, 4 in 5 people have a religious faith. And the proportion of the world's population that don't believe in God is shrinking, not growing. Did you know that in London, as many people attend church today as they did 100 years ago? Why this resurgence in faith? Well, as mentioned in the introduction, I'm an expert in drinking coffee with all sorts of people who believe all sorts of things. And what I've noticed in more recent years is a trend away from secularism, because people are beginning to discover that the questions that they ask cannot be satisfied by secular answers alone. And the coronavirus situation has only increased that sense all the more. An article on the BBC website considered how for a growing number of younger people, religion is back on the agenda. And a Jewish rabbi interviewed about this said he thought it was because religion provided some stability in uncertain times. This is what he said. He said, "I think it's an anchor in the world. We're all being tossed on stormy seas, and if you look out on the horizon and see a boat that seems to be sturdy and steady, you might want to get on it." When things are going well, you see, secularism can seem sufficient. But in times of uncertainty, it fails to satisfy intellectually and existentially. There is some sense, I want to suggest, within us that there's something missing when God is left out of the equation. Let me give you 2 examples from modern scientists who want to persuade you that all you need are secular answers. Here's Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist from Harvard. This is what he said. He said, "We are here because one odd group of fishes had a particular fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures, because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenacious species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive. By hook and by crook, we may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists." Or Oxford professor Richard Dawkins, "In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares, and we dance to its music." In a world that is hurting, those answers are not very satisfying, are they? In our search for significance and security, secularism doesn't really get us anywhere. And coronavirus has only exposed secularism's inherent weakness even further. George Monbiot in The Guardian earlier in the epidemic said COVID-19 is nature's wake-up call to a complacent civilization. We've been living in a bubble of false comfort and denial. In the rich nations, we've begun to believe that we have transcended the material world, that wealth we have accumulated has shielded us from reality. We persuaded ourselves that we'd reached the point all civilizations seek, insulation from natural hazards. Now the membrane has ruptured and we find ourselves naked and outraged. And he concludes, from now on, we should expose our minds to the painful realities we have denied for all too long, namely that we are contingent, dependent creatures. Secularism as a worldview says you must find all of your meaning in this world and this short life, which puts us under an incredible pressure. Because according to secularism, to have anything meaningful, things must go well. And I keep meeting people for whom life is not going that well, and they're starting to look elsewhere. Whether it's moments of joy that brings us to a point of transcendence and a desire to recognize the birth of a child as a gift, but a gift from whom and for what reason? or moments of personal sadness like a cancer diagnosis, a mental health struggle, or a loss of a job, people find the answers of Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins to be far from satisfactory. There's just too much about life unexplained, and too much in our lives that are untouched when we rule out higher answers. Secularism is too small a worldview to satisfy our souls. Federico Fellini said, "Like many people, I have no religion, and I'm just sitting in a small boat drifting with the tide. I just go on working, shooting." By the way, he was in cinema, so it doesn't mean shooting a gun. Working, shooting, cutting, editing, looking at life and trying to make others see. Today we stand naked, defenseless, and more alone than at any time in history. We are waiting for something, perhaps another miracle, perhaps the Martians. Who knows? So what to do? Maybe many, like you and like me, would say, I want to believe in something, but I don't know what that thing is. It's not easy, is it? After all, how can we ever be sure about something we can't even see? What if the idea of the God that I need is just a psychological crutch? Well, as we address the question of Christianity and its credibility, what is absolutely crucial for you to know is Christians don't believe in a meaning that we go out there to discover or maybe invent. We believe in a meaning that came into the world to find us. At the heart of the Christian claim is the idea that God himself came looking for us, not the other way around. And throughout this week of events, we're dipping into the Gospel of John, written by one of Jesus' friends and followers. And in his introduction, he writes this: "No one has ever seen God." That is true. But the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. This makes Christianity unique. Of all the world's religions, there really is no claim in human history like it, that God has entered our world. Let me give you a very simple illustration as we come to a close. Imagine that this room is locked and we have a case of collective amnesia. And we're scratching our heads to think where we are, why we're here, what's on the other side of the doors, but we can't see out. And so what happens? We begin to talk to each other. We begin to imagine what might be on the other side of the doors. Some of us might be very optimistic. I think it's a beach the other side of the doors. Other of us might be pessimistic. I think we've been put in here to die. Questions would fly. Who has brought us here? Why? What's outside the walls? And none of us could have an answer that we could be confident of, could we? We'd debate it till the cows came home. Unless and until someone opened the doors from the outside and came in to tell us what we could never know for ourselves. And that is the claim of Christianity, that God himself, in the person of his Son, has entered our world. God in flesh. No one has ever seen God, says John at the beginning of his gospel, but now God the Son has entered into our world so that we might know God and know him personally. Thank you for listening.
To our speakers tonight. And Neil will actually be joining us for the whole week. He'll be part of all of the real life events. So you'll have more opportunities to hear from him. The remainder of our time tonight is going to be spent in a time of question and answer. This is an opportunity to make the most of texting in any questions that you've got to pose to our different speakers. We aim to finish tonight around 7:15, so we may not have an opportunity to answer all of the questions that are texted in. But there will be an opportunity for further discussion and refreshments over in the Burgess Road Library, just a few minutes walk from here. You're all welcome to come and join us for hot and cold drinks and the opportunity to discuss what we've heard together in personal conversations, or to approach one of the speakers tonight for more conversation and question asking. At this point, I'm going to ask our speakers to join me back here on the stage. And we're going to have the opportunity to ask them some of the questions that we've been hearing. Thank you so much for joining us all. Let me start with a question for Simon. Thank you for your talk for us tonight. I can't work this phone. Interesting. Great. Simon, can we have confidence about the accuracy of the stories of Jesus' life, and as with the historical details in the gospel? Is it easier for the stories, quotes, miracles to become corrupted through oral transmission than the geographic details?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think one thing that might help on this is that I mentioned that the gap between Jesus' life and the Gospels is actually quite short. You know, it's in the living memory of many people, and in the case of the Gospels, the sources are not just. It's not just a case of a sequence of Chinese whispers, where one person passes on to another person, and so on. But actually, the sources for the Gospels are the people who knew Jesus themselves. So, in the case of Mark's Gospel, the prime source for Mark's Gospel was the disciple Peter, and similarly with the other Gospels as well. So it's not just a kind of a long sequence of one person passing it on to another person, passing it over a long period of time. It's actually A, quite a short period of time, and B, during that period of time, the disciples of Jesus themselves were still alive and active. Maybe that's partly getting at the question.
Thank you. That's really helpful. A question for you, Sharon. Can we confidently say that the miracles of the Bible, such as the miracles that Moses performed and Jesus' resurrection, are compatible with modern-day science? If so, why?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think this is another example of what I talked about, a faulty dilemma where people think they have to sort of choose between believing in a miracle or believing in, the laws of nature that science is uncovering. But actually, if we think about what laws of nature actually are, first of all, they're not actually measuring kind of certainties. They're actually probabilistic. They're saying that kind of most of the time, this is what will happen. So if I had a tennis ball right now and I were to sort of throw it out into the audience, the laws of nature would describe what normally happens, which is the trajectory of this ball through the air. But that doesn't mean that occasionally you can reach your hand up and catch the ball and send it on a completely different trajectory. And I suppose sort of part of the response that people give is actually that you need to know what normally happens in order to recognize a miracle, because you need to know the kind of the normal in order to recognize the paranormal. You need to know the natural in order to recognize the supernatural. You need to know what normally happens scientifically in order to recognize a miracle. And it's precisely because people don't normally get up from their graves and walk again that actually the resurrection of Jesus has this unique place in history, and people have kind of had all of these discussions around whether there are other possible explanations that could account for it, and actually some really thinking people that have done some very deep research came to the conclusion that the most logical explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead, and of course there are other miracles as well. And so I think that's probably part of an answer that I could give. It's not either or, but actually science tells you what normally happens. But the question that it really comes down to is, that I mentioned in my talk, is the natural world all that there is? Because if that is the case, if the answer to that is yes, then miracles are impossible. But if God exists, then he will be capable of establishing a world of regularities that science can uncover, and scientists can uncover in brilliant ways, but also of occasionally doing something extraordinary within that, perhaps suspending those laws. And not because he's a meddler, not because he likes to mess with us, but because this is a God who intervenes, who cares about human beings. And the times in which those laws have been doing something different is because God is wanting to make himself known. He's not hiding himself. He is actually wanting to reach down into human history so that you and I can know him.
Thank you. A question for you, Neil. Do the philosophical arguments for God, for example, the cosmological argument, provide evidence for his existence?
Well, I have enjoyed listening to one or two people of far greater intellect than myself present those arguments, and I've found them persuasive. William Lane Craig, in particular, is known to some of us who has developed the KLM cosmological argument and spoken at length about it. So I do find that is one of the reasons that I believe, as a Christian, I too came to faith as a university student, as Sharon did, and I found it was a combination of things. It certainly was some of the evidence for God, the moral arguments for God or cosmological arguments that some of us may be familiar with. But again, you struggle to get a name to God by looking at those arguments alone. They may be persuasive to a certain point. So it's the person of Jesus that helped me across the line to a particular faith in God. So God as Father with the Lord Jesus Christ as Saviour and Lord came through further investigation, which is essentially centred on what we find in the Bible. But I find as supporting arguments like the cosmological argument are persuasive, and I know many others have come to faith by considering those arguments for themselves.
Great, thank you. I've got a few questions which are for any of you to speak into. There's a question: hasn't Christianity caused more harm than good?
Well, I could make a start, but do feel free to add. I think that we are answering that question in a time that is kind of unlike no other. 10 years ago we could have answered that with plenty to go on in the history of Christianity. And actually, I'm not here to kind of in any way excuse the harm that has been done in the name of the Christian faith, and there has been much, and it's still happening. And but I think what I would want to say is that just because something is done in the name of Christianity doesn't mean it is done in line with the true kind of heart of that Christian faith. If you look at the person of Jesus Christ, you see a person who was never deceptive, somebody that was utterly trustworthy, somebody that told Peter, one of his followers, to put down his sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword, and actually repaired the damage done by that sword. We see someone who is actually living in a way that is radically different from the way of the world. And so just because something is done in the name of Christianity doesn't mean it actually represents the heart of that. But we recognize that is often the case, that people have experienced harm at the hands of Christians. And if you are asking that question and have experienced that, I actually want to say sorry to you for what you have experienced, and I fully believe that grieves God just as much as it grieves you. And I actually also do want to commend that there are communities of believers who are faithfully seeking God and wanting to live in line with the person of Christ that we see in the Bible, and that we know to be at work in the world today by the Holy Spirit. These aren't always the communities that make the headlines. they're sometimes harder to find because they're not concerned with the spotlight, or but they do exist, and so I want to say sorry to you. I want to say that doesn't represent the heart of Jesus Christ, who came to actually bring in a completely different kingdom. You know, we've got the kingdom of the world with all of its values, and that can be very damaging at times. God has come to do something very different to that. He says that the enemy comes to steal and kill and destroy, and there may be people here that feel like there are things that have been stolen and killed and destroyed. But Jesus says, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full, and that is possible to find even in a world in which much harm is being done by those who are not Christians and also by people who are. So I just want to continue to commend the person of Jesus to you. Thank you for the question.
If I might, just put an advert on Thursday evening. Billy's story is of growing up in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which of course were both political and religious. And his story is an extraordinary one, and just encourage you to maybe, if that is your question or you have questions like that, to consider coming back on Thursday and hearing his story about what was done in the name of religion and what he discovered in terms of a living faith in Jesus Christ for himself.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question, and again, for perhaps a few perspectives on this. You've spoken about evidence for the Christian belief, but not proof of God. If God really does exist, why doesn't he make himself more obvious?
Well, I cut the last part of my talk because of time, and I actually addressed that question head on, so I won't give you my last 2 minutes of my talk that got cut. But what I will do is attempt to summarize it in maybe 15 to 20 seconds. What I was going to say as a conclusion was that actually all of the things that really matter to us, the things that we really are passionate about, are things that we cannot prove scientifically. And the three examples that I was going to give you was the three examples that I'm utterly persuaded of, that I can't prove to you in any way, is that murder is wrong, that Mozart was a musical genius, and that my children love me. And yet my whole life revolves around those kind of commitments that are not just beliefs intellectually, but things that I base my life upon. That murder is wrong, that my children love me, and that I can enjoy beautiful music. And that is true of each one of us. We base our lives on things that we can't scientifically prove. But it doesn't mean they're just kind of jumps, a leap of faith. That my children love me is not a leap of faith. It's based on all sorts of evidence that I piece together over time and have become persuaded of. So I just want to put that to you, that the things that you really are committed to and the things that you are passionate about, you cannot prove scientifically, but the evidence will lead you towards them and not away from them. And I think that's what I would say about the Christian faith. That's how it works too.
And I would just add that even science doesn't offer proof. There's this misnomer right there that science offers immutable facts that are unchanging, and that's just not the case. I mean, there are probably practicing scientists in the room, and I was one for 11 years. And, you know, science proceeds by kind of levels of certainty and, again, probabilities and likelihoods, but it doesn't speak about absolute conclusive proof. And so that, you know, there are levels of certainties, there are inferences to the best explanation. And actually what we're offering you tonight is, what is the inference to the best explanation for human existence and the things that we long for and seem to be wired for. So even science doesn't offer proof.
Same in history. I mean, historical proof is a very tenuous sort of notion as well. And I think I'd go back to what the two of you both pointed out, that the fact that you can have an argument and have and reason about these things is based on the fact that our brains are not just sort of chattering synapses, but actually think God's thoughts after him and can think in logical and reasonable ways.
Thank you so much for responding to those questions. There were many more excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to speak into all of them. And may I again welcome you to join us at the Burgess Road Library on Burgess Road, just a few minutes walk from here. for an opportunity for refreshments, but also to find one of our speakers tonight and make the most of more opportunities to chat with them and ask questions. Let's give our contributors tonight a round of applause for all they've done. Wonderful, and thank you too for coming tonight. Now we're having the opportunity to head over to the Burgess Road Library, where you'll find information about all the different events that are coming up over this week. And also, if you'd like, you can receive a free copy of that John's Gospel, one part of the Bible, which you can take away yourself. The refreshments there are for you to enjoy amongst yourself in personal conversation, or to find one of our speakers who will be positioned in the corners of the room. And so if you head to one of the corners, you'll find our three speakers there. Over in the library, it's not mandatory to wear a face covering when you are seated with refreshments, but please do wear them whilst you are walking around the building. And indeed, keep your coverings on as we leave the building tonight. We'll be directed out of the building, and it will start from the back to the front, and please wait before someone ushers you out of the room. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the evening.